I am Dr. You can call me Dr. J, you can call me Dr. Washington. We're going to go ahead and get started, but I first want to get started by allowing our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. So, Christopher, if you would like to go ahead and begin the introduction, and then the other two, you just go ahead and jump right in and we'll get started.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Green. I am an IB teacher in Switzerland. I've been teaching in Switzerland for approximately 15 years. Before that, I was in Portugal, and before that, I was in the UK. I'm also an IB workshop leader, and I'm also an accreditor for CIS and the International Baccalaureate Organization. I look forward to this discussion. I think it's a necessary one. And yeah, I hope you all have plenty of things to say about this so we can have a constructive dialogue.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Mayor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Meher. I am originally Indian. I grew up in the Netherlands where I did international education for 11 years. And last year, I graduated with the IB diploma. And now I'm studying law at the London School of Economics. I'm in my first year, and I have done quite a bit of work, or rather, I have a very strong interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have done some work in recreation of curricula. So I'm really excited to talk about this today.
Thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you. And Juan, you are up.
Hi, I'm Juan. I'm from South Africa. I always, part of my identity is being an anti-apartheid activist. That's kind of just part of my role and who I am. I'm an administrator at UNIS Hanoi. I worked at the American School of Johannesburg, left Africa, the continent, to pursue leadership positions, as we do know that often people from the host country struggle to find leadership positions within the international schools within their countries, doing equity, inclusion, and diversity work, and I'm an administrator too. So welcome to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Juan. So we have about 6 questions that we'll be asking, and I'm going to ask just an introductory question that is not a part of our line of questioning. And so I would like for our panelists to just hop on right in there. And so my first question for you all is, what has been your interaction with racial slurs that you might have experienced or that you might have had to discuss or resolve an issue as a leader in your school? Any one of y'all can take that question. It doesn't matter who wants to start. Go ahead.
Okay.
And then
I think from an administrator point of view and a teacher point of view, I think for me, one of the challenges is that racial slur is common. I think also that racial slur, the words are changing. We just discovered a new list when we asked kids about filling in a form about what kind of racial slurs they experience. The words are changing. So it's not the traditional words that we even know in terms of that. And so looking at how that impacts culture of the school, the students that are there, the safety, the well-being, I think racial slur permeates the recipient of the slurs. The impact is far greater than what we often acknowledge in our schools, in our policies, and what's happening in our day-to-day lives within the classrooms. And we need that, yeah. So that's something that I'm really keenly aware of, is the impact that it has.
okay. Thank you for that, Chris. Or Mayor, do you have anything to add into your experience, your personal experience with racial slur in your school or even in your matriculation as a student?
Maya, would you like to go ahead first? I think I've got.
Yeah. So I stayed at the same school my entire life. It was a very white school, though it was international, it was very white. And so when these slurs were used, written on walls even, I found that the response of teachers, administrators, staffs, and students was completely insufficient, in that there was almost nothing until there was once. And I'd like to talk about that a bit later. That was a genuinely effective response. But this, alongside a very unrepresentational curriculum, it is so harmful because it creates in particularly white students. I am worried about the impact it has on people of color, but on white students, it creates this kind of ignorance that they don't care. Ultimately, when they see these words then used in the real world, they don't care. They don't realize the value, the emphasis that it really has on the person. And that's what my exposure has been mainly. But not only have I seen then the slurs being used and the community responses, but I have seen sometimes effective leadership in how to tackle that.
Right. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having us, first of all. So the concept of race is prevalent throughout not only schools, but within our own societies. So this concept that's found within majority of major societies is not even based upon like our phenotypes anymore or biological hereditary. Sometimes it's just relies upon assumptions, cultural assumptions, and presumed incompatibility, which people think is irrecoverable. I think from being around 4 or 5 years old, I've been racially abused. So someone has said something to me, which has been inappropriate, which has been rude, which has been harsh, and not understood why I've been called this as a child is damaging psychologically, and that can also permeate into adulthood from my personal experience. I'm not even saying this from the whole idea of just being a black male. I think that racial epithets and racial slurs are throughout all different kinds of people. I want to try and avoid this whole idea of race, because it kind of slips into ethnicity, nation, and religion as well, and also culture. And so what happens is this ambivalent term race just becomes something that is insipidly mixed between all different parts of ourselves. Has it happened in our schools and in the international schools I worked in every single one, countless of times? Has it been resolved satisfactorily? That's subjective, because most of the time, the people who are doing the organization of resolving it have never experienced racial slurs directed toward them. So how could they possibly be the ones who are able to say it's satisfactorily resolved? You need to have experiential as well as theoretical background to be able to resolve something that has such a psychological effect upon the learners and the educators and any other stakeholders within your community. People don't like it when I talk about this, because I feel like I open up a wound, or I reveal put a mirror in front of them that they're sometimes not willing to confront. I also put in a post that I'm tired of talking about it as well. I'd like to be an educator and just an educator as such. However, it is race and the concept of race and racial slurs has just been such a pervasive and damaging disease throughout my life and throughout the lives of people around me, that there's something that needs to be done. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Chris. And I think both you, Mayor, and Juan have brought up something very interesting, because all of you talked about the impact that it has had on you or your students. Also, these slurs being, kind of founded with inside of assumptions, and also administrators not having the experience to maybe adequately address these issues. And our first question was, do administrators fully understand? And I don't think that's the case, but I think a more interesting question is, how can administrators begin to fully understand the impact of racial slurs on teachers, on their faculty and staff, and even as themselves, and how they're reflecting on their practices? So do you all have any thoughts on that?
For me, it's interesting that we have, for students, we create a safe environment to learn in. And that's something that we work really hard in as institutions. I think that then there sometimes also needs to be a focus of workplace safety for teachers, and especially teachers from diverse backgrounds and from multicultural backgrounds. And so you always need to have those safety in place. What's a safe workplace for example, for myself in a predominantly white space? what does safety look for me as a teacher when I enter into, or an administrator even? Oh, sorry. So yeah, so that's the one part that we really need to understand in terms of that, and then the culture. And I do also think that even when we have policies in place, is how do we apply those policies? Because sometimes we have the perfect word, we have wonderful DIJ statements, but how do we live them and implement them is something that we really need to look at. With the caveat also that I don't believe in the space of zero, like kind of like zero policy, right? You can't do that, because interesting enough, if you do that, the result would be that it would impact actually a lot of kids of color. When we do a zero-based tolerance language policy, for example, in terms of racial slur, there is that caveat that we need to be careful of.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to go if possible. So I like to stick on that point about experiential and theoretical ideas within being an administrator. And while it's impossible to make blanket statements about all school administrators, because that would make us as bad as maybe some other people, many could be aware of the social and significant psychological impact of racial slurs can have on various different kinds of people within their community, but their depth of understanding can greatly vary depending on their personal experiences. And so what we need to do is purely pragmatic, is we need to see more people of diverse backgrounds within administrative roles. Now, this isn't just saying on a surface level of it being color and religion and things like this. We need to have people who have been in different countries, or dealt with people in terms of who are different races and religions, but they also need to think about how they have experience within intercultural competencies. So some people may have first-hand experiences with the effect of racial discrimination, either through their own experiences or through those of their students, colleagues, or family members. But we need to have, obviously, impactful training that isn't just something that's one day, but actually is drip fed throughout the whole of their careers. So they're aware of this, and they're aware of, and they're aware that race, like any virus, like any disease, changes and adapts. So we need to stay on top of that. So training needs to be consistent and constant. But I think that a lot of teachers and administrators within international schools, they live within a bubble. We find ourselves within these sort of expatriate bubbles, particularly in certain nations, and culturally how certain nations treat international schools as well. So they're in this sort of bubble where it's kind of like a protective system, no trouble in the bubble, as it were. But actually, they never really develop an interaction with the people who they're actually living beside. So maybe more exposure to the home culture might help in regards to intercultural understanding as well. Another way of administrators becoming more aware of racial slurs and how to treat them is they need to listen to their students. It seems such an easy thing, but how many schools are really providing these affinity groups? And if they're providing these affinity groups, are they being surveyed, like, panopticon kind of thing, or are these students actually allowed to speak their own mind and become their true selves? And I don't know, I just think that sometimes when you go onto certain websites of schools and you see all the heads of the school or the administrators of the school looking the same, speaking the same, acting the same, the time has passed for that kind of prospectus where they want a certain kind of person on the front cover of the. You need to look at the people who are the most apt and most professional and most ready to do the work. Forget the surname, forget the accent, and look into why they are being in an international school and what their approach is in an international school, and and their experience with people who aren't like them. And I think that's very important. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Mayor, do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I fully agree with this thing about how, like I've said, I've been in international education in the same school for 11 years, and I think I had three teachers who were people of color. And it's really damaging.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a story a little bit later about when a racial slur was used and what the response was. But it's only really effective when you see, of course, represented people of color in your education, the ones that are teaching you and engaging in the subjects you love and leading your school. But they're really the only ones that will understand. When it's a predominantly white community for such a long time, when these kinds of things happen, they don't, since they're not the ones who feel the emotional trauma and burden from the words used, they don't really care. They don't really understand. And I think professional development is completely lacking when it comes to how to deal with these things, but also just how to understand students and where they're coming from. I fully understand, fully agree with you, Christopher, with the thing about how teachers are not listening to their students. When I went to talk about how the curricula needs to be changed because there were some blatant problems in it which were causing bullying and teasing, nobody listened to me until I continued on that path for like 2 years. It's really hard. And hearings, like, why do we need to actually take action only when slurs are used? We should be doing that before, and teachers should be understanding the impact. You should not have to sit in a meeting with a teacher and explain why the use of a slur by another person hurt you. Like,
Yeah.
it's so clear. Why should I explain that?
Yeah. So to add to that, I just think that's what you said there. I mean, how was on point. The whole idea about us being preemptive when these things occur rather than being reactive. Proactivity needs to happen. It's too much of the time. It feels like it's about the role of the administrator. If you're a good manager, you're meant to be able to read what's going to happen next, and you're meant to be able to make sure that the people in your community are ready for when that event happens. I mean, for example, how many fire drills have you had in school? Like, let's be honest, right? How many fire drills do people have in school? You're telling me that they're not prepared for when there's a racial slur? They had many times the opportunities to prepare themselves for that. So
Yeah,
why is this happening? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to reiterate in terms of there's two things in terms of we know that students will not report to someone that doesn't look like them. That's the reality in international school. We've had conversations with our students, and they feel very uncomfortable to report any identity harm, to, as a matter of fact, and with especially with containing racial slur to a white person. And when asked why, it was their experience is that they almost feel they have to justify and explain the incident that happened, rather than when you have a person that reflects them, that understands the context. The other part also that we need to be keenly aware of is that if we do invite administrators of color onto our teams and into our schools, that they have the support to do the work effectively. Because that's the challenge with a lot of administrators of color. There are so few of us around that when we end up in a school, it can be very isolating trying to work on this by yourself, because you are in some ways also by yourself when there's no one else in the team that reflects you.
That's a brilliant point. The whole idea of that you have to have that entire burden of the race situation on your shoulders just because of who you look like, when it should actually be a holistic issue around the whole community.
I wholeheartedly agree. That's a very huge part of research, is having the proper representation for students, but also that burden that is carried by leaders of color inside of a school, and them essentially dealing with the same situations of race and racial slurs that the students are, just on an adult level. So thank you for bringing up all those points. And with that being said, talking about being proactive instead of reactive, what are some ideas that you all have around about how schools can effectively implement educational programs or even trainings to raise awareness about the history and impact of racial slurs, and specifically in this environment in international schools?
So I'm sorry to just jump in there. I mean, curriculum integration is definitely something that's important. The UNESCO have just recently issued out a new document called Unmasking Racism Guidelines for Educational Materials. You can just Google Unmasking Racism Guidelines UNESCO, and that's a guide regarding textbooks and talking about how that ensures that students have exposure to important topics such as scientific racism, cultural hegemony, and other sorts of injustices caused by slurs. So they can realize that race is a sociological rather than biological phenomena, because that can just hinder growth and prosperity. We all know, I'm a literature teacher predominantly, and we all know that you can have diverse literature from a range of different authors from a range of different cultures. So that's obviously something we can do there as well. And I'm not talking about bookending something with a black author at the end. I'm talking about how you can try and incorporate different kinds of cultures from around the world. Even various different types of peoples from around the world can be seen and heard and represented within the text, because that's what the way that life is in real life. And that can be seen in historical texts too. So I don't want to hear anyone tell me that they can't find diverse texts from 500 years ago and things like this. There are plenty of texts, and I don't even have to talk about that anymore. So resources there which encourage critical thinking and discussion around these materials would be good. Guest speakers and workshops. I've been very blessed to be able to invite someone like Akala to the schools I've had. A lot of banging on the doors. Who is he? Why is he coming? But it worked out. There was also a panel I ran between a rabbi and imam and a Buddhist monk. It was called Coexist, and the students and other members of the community were able to ask these religious leaders questions. So it broke down some preconceived notions as well. Student-led initiatives. I did a thing called Culture Week, where we had different exercises. We looked at short films and things like this. We looked at a short film called Feeling Through, actually, which was about a man who was deaf and blind. And he's been helped by an African-American guy around the town because he was lost for his date. And it was an interesting movie as well. And then obviously policy. I mean, we talk about policy so much, but how can that policy be enforced as well? And what parameters do we use to show that enforcement? And I've got to say, people like the accreditors, CIS, IB, these sort of people, they have a responsibility to make sure that these things are being enforced within their checkups or within their being critical friends within schools.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I agree. We definitely need to work on the curriculum. That's the first step, because that's what you're learning. That's why you're at school. Yeah. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I read this book. They were trying to make the curriculum more diverse, and it was about an Indian girl. And of course, I was like, oh, finally, I get to read about someone like myself. But it turned out that the book was about child marriage, of course, and it's so badly portrayed my people, my country. It was just outright inaccurate at points. And it was written by a white woman who had never stepped foot in Asia, which was ridiculous. So like you said, really making sure that we are finding texts that accurately represent these people. It's not just there to kind of add the diversity requirement that you're trying to meet. So that's definitely critical. I think something that's so important holistically throughout all education is the focus on storytelling and the voices of the people that we're trying to represent. I actually created a framework called emo empathy. I can talk more about that later. And where we really just focus on storytelling as the central point of every pillar of education. So from history, we need more primary sources. We can definitely find primary sources. I remember when I was learning slavery for the first time. So I live in the Netherlands. So of course the Dutch had quite a significant role in that. I learned about it for the first time through the perspective of the slavers. We learned about the Dutch Golden Age. We did not learn about the perspectives of the enslaved, except for watching the movie Roots, which was optional, by the way. So more primary resources is critical. I mean, interviews, books, stories, we can find them so easily, like Christopher said. And then again, already addressed literature. It's so important. One more thing I think is critical is storytelling in a homeroom capacity as well. I think homeroom, whatever schools do provide it, don't understand its importance. I think what it should be is something that a place where students can come mental health check, a place to really just kind of be at home and discuss things that matter to us as individuals and learn life skills. And it is exactly there where we should be sharing stories about each other's experiences, bringing in people to talk about that. Because it is when you tell your story, your experience with race or with even other things like mental health, or when teachers start to tell their stories, that you really understand, because there's so much science behind storytelling and how that renders empathy. So I think when we start storytelling ourselves, when I start talking about my experiences and I feel like I'm not being judged because I'm in that intimate kind of setting where I can do so, when others are sharing stories about their experiences, that's what's really going to generate empathy. And along with more diverse and representational curricula, that's what's really going to enable understanding in the community. I think, therefore, like a story-centric approach is critical.
For me, from an organizational point of view, I mean, you look at the websites and it is true, they have the mission, the vision, the values and everything else. But it's interesting to ask the question in terms of where does this issue or response lies from admission. So if you're looking at, we are doing the diversity and equity work and we have a anti-racist statement, for example. Where does that fit into the admission process, where we can talk about when you join as a family, this is our values and this is what we stand as. When you do when you have teachers join the school, where does those things fit in so that you're building the culture of the school? And we know that if we're an anti-racist school, and I'm being very narrow with that at the moment, and I apologize for that. But if we're an anti-racist school, where does that live in the different structures within our school? Because that's a school, as a school culture in terms of that. And I don't think we really address those kind of things. We kind of just brush it over. It's in the handbook or it just lives over there. But we don't necessarily unpack it with our teachers, with our parents, with the students, with the staff, with everybody that enters onto our campus. We don't really unpack those aspects of anti-racism. And so we tend to navigate blindly. And you are right, Chris, when something pops up and then we react in terms of that. Right. So those are the processes. So even if you, before you, like when you apply to the school, these are conversations that you need to have with a family, that, you know, when you're entering into this community, this is what we stand for, and this is what we are against. And that needs to be clearly articulated to everybody that joins the community. And I don't think we often do that.
Thank you, Juan. And I think something that's interesting that I ran across in my research, talking about storytelling and curricula, because you all have done an excellent job with using curricula and storytelling as a way to be proactive about racial slurs and just what your school believes in creating anti-racist environments. Something that I wasn't taken aback by, but the intricate level of racism that was actually in the foundation of a lot of international schools is something that we don't talk about. We don't talk about how there is a entirely historical context to racism in these schools, and that's why it continues to be pervasive, because we can't deal with, you know, the history. So with that being said, we've talked about the proactivity with, you know, maybe building up faculty, staff, students, and school leaders, but how can we use storytelling, curricula, and student leadership to respond to the use? Like, so we know there's a proactive piece, but when it has to be a reactive piece, how can those elements come to play in helping resolve the matters?
Janai, I just want to step up one step back. I'm going to throw this out internationally. I would like to know if there's a school that has actually physically looked at dismantling their white oppressive systems. That's something that
yeah, I did not find that, but I think that's
a
question I'm about to write down.
That's something I'm struggling with right now. I'm kind of asking myself, which school internationally has either recorded, researched, or actually dismantled white supremacist systems? Because you talk about, it's a lot of the schools are based, their identities are based on that. We know that. They clearly articulate that. And yet there's this, when would it be dismantled? That's my question. And who will start?
Will they?
Sorry for skipping in terms of
No,
that.
you're okay. But I think that's a part of the conversation because I think a lot of excellent work is done in response, and because, you know, people are fighting for their lives, trying to make sure that we're creating these equitable environments. But no one is actually talking about dismantling. We do a lot of work surrounding trainings on anti-racism, and, you know, how not to be a racist. But we're really not talking about that idea because we matriculate, we work there, we leave, and then there's a whole new group of people that perhaps have the same beliefs of the people that are leading the school. And or something that I was thinking about when you all were talking with not having diverse leadership is that perhaps the people that they are hiring are also, you know, systemic in carrying on the issue. And so where we cannot be proactive, how can we be reactive with dismantling, with storytelling, with curricula, especially if we know these curriculums are coming from, they're very American centric, they're very Eurocentric, and even somewhat erasing the idea of identity in and of themselves. And so sometimes we find in this curricula that we are erased because we're all the human race without acknowledging whitewashing, without acknowledging our differences. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I think curriculum is a very interesting part of it, but how can you carry on in curriculum without it being whitewashed and without the basis being we should all love and belong? And that's where we start, without identifying our differences that matter to us. Any thoughts? Okay.
It's
So go ahead, Chris.
it's a really expansive question, but in terms of the response, I would say that you know, we need to have some further incorporation of social emotional learning within the curriculum. And like Meha said, the whole emphasis on homeroom in terms of dealing with relationship skills, social awareness, self-management, those sort of aspects were really helpful for that. In terms of this question looks in terms of reacting to a situation where you cannot, where the system's already set up, right? Where there's already been something happening like this. Again, I think it depends on the students, but I do think it's important to empower the students to take a role in terms of leading their own peers in terms of what they believe isn't right. Because as we were saying, Juan was talking about how slurs can change, and I think that was a really good idea, doing a questionnaire on the students, asking them about the development of language, as obviously, as we know, as linguists, develops and changes, and it also has different contexts in terms of different cultures. In South Africa, colored is very different to being colored in the United States. For example, we're seeing that with Tyler right now. But in terms of peer education, I think that'd be really important too. So having a situation where students are able to air or to display when they feel it's offensive, and that's it. It's not up to the teacher or anyone else to decide on what is not. Oh, let's just pick that one. I've heard of that one, so that one's okay. No, students should be involved in policy making too, and they should be involved in what they believe to be offensive. And that is just something that the leadership and teachers and everyone else needs to agree with. And that's how people get along. They feel safe. So even if you thought, oh, well, it's not so bad in my country, this slur, well, it is here, and it is within this bubble. So that's how the culture of the bubble should react.
Thank you for that. And Chris, you kind of just hit on our very next question. After there's an incident of offense of a racial slur, what kind of teacher-student interaction is necessary to address, redress, and grow for those students?
Could I hop in there?
Absolutely.
I'd also just like to ask a question. Christopher brought up student leadership and in policy making as well. I think that's so important, but what do you do when you're in an environment where none of the students care? Because I had that experience. I cared, maybe the other person of color cared, but what about the others who just don't? So that's definitely something to think about, how to make them care. And that's where I think how to respond to these situations is so relevant. I'll give an example. So I think when I was in the ninth grade, someone wrote the N-word on the wall, and it was quite a visible place. And it was like, it wasn't removed for a while. I'm not sure why. There was a lot of talk about, oh, it merely not because the word wasn't used in corridors anyway, it was, but because it was displayed so vibrantly there. And the school didn't really know how to respond. It was very clear because they weren't responding. And we thought maybe there would be like a lecture or like a, I don't know, the email sent home. There was nothing of the sort. But what did end up happening, which was something that one of the teachers took up as an initiative, was effective, at least in the short term. We had this teacher who was a person of color. She was African American, and she randomly during homeroom came into every single advisory class. And all she did was she put up a slideshow. And we thought, oh, yeah, this is going to be a lecture. But what it really was just like 5 or 6 photographs of her growing up as a child and then in her teens, and finally as an adult with 2 children herself, daughters who are also people of color. And all she did was tell us her story. She told us about how racism had impacted every facet of her life growing up, how it still impacts her. And then she linked it to the use of the word. And I could literally see people were crying because they'd never seen the emotions that were associated with the use of the word. And so when it was finally presented to them, palpable with these photos here, it did change them. I could tell that at least for a while, I didn't hear the word used. Suddenly, it wasn't a funny thing because, of course, given the people who were using these words, they thought it was cool, which it was not. Suddenly, it was shunned and condoned. And so, yeah, storytelling is incredibly powerful. And if we have more of these teachers, people who you see in your environment from a day-to-day basis, become sensitive and vulnerable and comfortable sharing this, I think it's such a powerful response. Another thing, so I forgot to add that I was ALOC's, I believe, first intern, and now I'm the lead intern with ALOC. And one of the things that I was asked to do was do some research on which schools have a policy for responding to use of racial slurs. And I did this research, and I was shocked to find how few schools actually have this. Because when you do, just like an anti-bullying policy, it shows the world that you are actually going to do something about it. But there was nothing like that in my school, I discovered, and there still isn't. I did that research like 3 years ago. I checked last night. There's still no such policy. So I think that's something, it's a little bit more like latent, showy on the outside, but is also very relevant. So both of these elements, internal and outside, are so important.
Yeah.
I just want to add in terms of when we, and I don't like comparing and kind of like, but I am going to, we spend a lot of time on neurodiversity, and a lot of schools invest in neurodiverse programs, which is really important. Please don't get me wrong. They also look at the queer community and the harm that exists there, and they invest a lot of money in terms of bringing consultants on board and making sure that those students are safe. And that's also really important. It's interesting if we look at students of color and how much the school invests in those students and invests in training teachers to be able to help those students navigate their spaces. It's just an interesting take. So I'm always wondering why it stops at students of color. Why does the money dry up there in the training? But everything else has money for that. So it's just something to think about and to ask schools, and as you develop PD, to ask those questions in terms of that. Because that's the harsh realities in which our students live.
I think just to add to what Juan said is that and what Meha said is that from what I'm reading is that there seems to be a lack of investment, first of all, but also a lack of care. But this is a well-being issue. Everything aside, well-being issue. We have obviously LGBTQ concerns, obviously neurodiversity concerns, and various concerns with different members of our community. Holistically, this is a well-being issue. So if they're looking at racial slurs and how it affects their students psychologically and mentally, and how it affects their teachers and other stakeholders, they're going to find it, we actually are going to find it's going to be a well-being issue, which will in effect affect the school's experience, the school experience for the students, the teachers, and other stakeholders. And it will also affect students' grades, for example, which then will have a knock-on effect on how people perceive the school. So once the once the money starts not coming in, and once the reputation starts becoming tarnished, once word of mouth starts going around, then that will have a knock-on effect. Then you will have to then therefore measure well-being. Racialization is simplistic, yet it's artfully concealed, and at times subconsciously within our international education systems, be it from who we hire, what texts we teach and how we teach them, or how we relate to each other in our classrooms. Racial slurs are a mental health and well-being issue. And if you don't address it, it will slowly but surely come up and creep up, and it will reveal its ugly head. So one of the ways and steps we can do this is we've got to have open dialogue with this, initiate open and honest dialogue where students and other stakeholders have a level playing field as well as the teachers. This isn't a situation where the teachers know more. Sometimes they have no idea about it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So sometimes we need to shut up. We need to be active listeners again, and we need to take upon that role of being an active listener, validate people's feelings. Even if we don't feel or have a sense of it, we need to validate that we're listening. And also use these educational opportunities for ourselves and build from that. And then if it's a psychological issue, like you were saying, invest in the counseling, invest in the help as well. People go away for, seek counseling for depression and other mental health issues, but they don't see that racial slurs, or we sometimes don't see racial slurs as being the reason that people are going away for that. Oh, teachers suffer burnout. Why do they suffer burnout? Oh, it's due to stress. Why is that stress happening? Because of perhaps implicit and institutionalized racism within the whole setup, which they weren't aware of in the first place, and which the leaders weren't aware of in the first place, because they haven't really realized how their behaviors and how their microaggressions can have a knock-on effect and will affect their teachers, which then will affect their students, which will then affect their grades, which will then affect their learning. So the more and more we look at it from a separate point of view, we say racial slurs here, neurodiversity there, all these other aspects are demarcated, it's divide and conquer, when actually it's a holistic issue, it's a mental health issue. And that is what really we need to try and emphasize upon.
I just want to follow on with Christopher in terms of that, because what that moves to, it moves into a space of child safeguarding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it should be, because the impact and the harm of racism and institutional racism on our students that are experienced every day is a child safeguarding issue. Because 100%. If the classroom and the school is not a safe environment for people of color, then we need to address that like anything else. And it's terrible to say, but I've always have it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one incident. It's micro incidents all over every day that child walks into on that campus. And so it should be pivoted as a child safeguarding issue, because that's what it comes first. We want to keep our students safe. And if we can't do that, and so that's why also it's kind of like parked somewhere under something, right? But not always visible, but everything else is visible. And so for me, it's really important to start moving the whole kind of like racism and just like the experience of under child safeguarding. We have to do it. We are obligated to do it.
So you all are bringing up fantastic points. And I've been reading the chat while you all have been talking and watching the responses. And something which is a part of some of our next questions, someone said it is a career suicide when you begin to share your story, when you begin to protect students. And so because when I look at myself as a researcher, as a school leader, I'm a person that we have to protect teachers as well, because those are going to be the first lines of people that are dealing with our students. So there are levels of safeguards that need to be put in place for everyone, because we know how this turns out for those of us that are fighting these battles. Eventually, we are removed. And so keeping that in mind when we're looking at different strategies to implement, because as we know, a lot of the time, nobody is safe when we start moving into areas of safeguarding. And so with that being said, how can we empower stakeholders to respond proactively and constructively with both students, families, and teachers to racial slurs or safeguarding when these events happen?
I think for me, sorry, interested parties is a really important concept in terms of that. Who are the interested parties? The other part is, if, how do I put it? You need to be very clear about the community you are joining beforehand. If you that's the one thing. Be true to yourself and who you are and what you stand for before you enter into that community. That's the one thing. That's one of, not advice, but just a part of the journey. Do not kind of put walls up around your equity, your inclusion, diversity work. Do not. That's who you need to be. And if that community accepts you, then yes, you enter into that space. But it's not guaranteed, because we also have experiences where we enter into that space to do the work, and then when we start doing the work, people get really uncomfortable about it. And it's like, oh, it's like, oh, we brought you in. Oh, but we don't like that. That makes us feel uncomfortable. Oh, we don't, it's hard work, to be honest with you. It's hard work. It's isolating. Sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. There's no magic wand with regards to that. But I do think you need to have a systematic approach in terms of where that, and it starts with the student's experience. I genuinely think it starts with the student's experience, and with the caveat that they are not there to remove systemic racism. They are there to express their lived experiences. And
Absolutely.
us as adults to take and listen to those stories and say, what do we do about it, and what do we respond, and how do we respond to it? So it's like a tough thing, but yes, we want students involved, but we need to be careful that they're not carrying the weight of the system change.
I think I completely agree with that. I think obviously that comes with teachers as well, who perhaps encountered racial slurs or been a victim of racial slurs, or that we've got to avoid this isolation. Because if we then carry on what Juan was saying about it being a safeguarding issue, then we should create a culture of reporting, right? If there's a safeguarding issue, we create a culture of reporting. If we've heard something, stand up, speak up, say it, and make sure that students have the backing of the administrators and of teachers to be able to say, hey, I heard something. Okay, great. Can you write it down? When I've witnessed, or when I've been told that someone said something, I asked the perpetrator and the witness to separately write down what they felt, what happened. It's an incident. It's a safeguarding incident. So just like you have a child protection issue, you ask the student what happened, you get them to write stuff down. If we start to write stuff down, we start to monitor and start to look at it in that proper reporting manner, then it starts to get gravitas. Obviously, schools throughout the UK and in other schools in the United States have this reporting system, but it's then what we do with that reporting system and where it goes. It doesn't go into a sort of other folder. It should go in the safeguarding main drive, right? And this should be logged, and it should be made sure that we read the situation as a safeguarding issue, and we address that, and we're serious about it. Silence is complicity, right? So sometimes a lot of schools ignore, and they're silent. They think, okay, we'll just ignore it. And also, I feel like sometimes managers need to be given the confidence to address the situations as well. I mean, a lot of the time it's saying managers should do this, administrators should do this, but I think that they should need support also, because they're also running the school. And sometimes it feels like sometimes poor management is where you're firefighting. We're just trying to put out the worst fire, right? Okay, that's not so bad. Okay, the kid got called a racial slur, but also these parents are very important to the school, so I'm just going to ignore this, right? We need to make sure that they feel protected too. So provide appropriate training, of course, and enable them to feel that they have the strength. Don't isolate people who are victims of the slurring and are victims of racism, and create a language of culture perhaps within the policy that ensures that they can use a specific language to address these situations. so they don't feel like they're in a situation where they like might say the wrong thing, whatever that might be. So yeah, that's my thing. A culture reporting, appropriate language, and the use of language that's agreed upon by all stakeholders, and not isolating people.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have about 5 minutes left, and so I have one more question. And Mehar, I want you to kind of begin the closing on this question because it all encompasses everything that Juan, Chris, and Mehar have been talking about this entire panel. So what measures can be taken to create and foster a more inclusive and respectful school culture that discourages the use of racial slurs? And I want you to start because you are fresh out of that environment more so than the rest of us. And so I would love for you to go ahead and lead us into this final part of our panel discussion.
Thank you. I think something I would have loved is, of course, if people cared more, but you can't necessarily do that until the environment, education, and administrators also facilitate that change. When I talked about how, our school didn't have a response policy to racial slurs, and, given its history, it had quite an interesting one. And I told my peers they didn't care at all. And so related to that, I wanted to ask Christopher, sorry, that can happen later as well. But I was wondering, how do we actually create that culture of reporting when there's so much cancellation and also counter cancellation that can be worse for the person who's already experienced racial abuse? So that's definitely something to address. But what I would have loved is if when these things happened, there was more storytelling, but also before these things happened, there was more storytelling. I want to be able to talk about my experience and hear that of others. I want my peers to understand why I feel different to them because they don't recognize the struggles that I have. Why, I feel more unsafe when there are police around me, knowing that there have been incidents with people of my kind and the police. I just want them to understand that and to understand then why not having a policy within what is supposed to be a very safe environment within the four walls of the school, why that hurts in a way, especially after being at a school for 11 years. So what I would have loved is just more action, more effort. I want to see effort, even through the little things like having that policy, but mostly through storytelling. And like we've been discussing, having a platform to talk as students, but also as teachers. I want to hear their story. So I think that's what I would have loved.
Thank you so much. Chris or Juan?
That's a really big question. I love the storytelling. As most who know me, I do tell stories, and I love stories. But you are right. It's to be able to make that connection to storytelling and personal experience, and at the same time challenging the dominant culture of storytelling through diversity. And so that requires schools to make the move to get a diverse faculty to be able to tell different stories from different perspectives in terms of that. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Christopher, bring us home.
I think lastly here, all the people here, thank you so much for coming. We're all a family under one international roof, right? And we all want peace. If we're trying to engender peace, we have to destroy the concept of race in terms of its ultimate goal, which is to separate us all. We are all diverse and wonderful in our own respects, but we need to realize that the conceptualization of race can be wholly destructive. One of the things that schools can do, and I think that schools can do this well, is partner with groups like ALOC, acknowledge that no man or no woman or no other person is an island, and ensure that we can work on this together and be open and honest in terms of dialogue and discussion and active listening to those who actually have gone through it all and have gone through these situations such as racial abuse, which can be aligned. I noticed that there was a question about reporting. It should be connected to the same idea as even sexual violence and other aspects that we find within our schools, unfortunately. It is of the same level in terms of the psychological effect it can have on students and teachers and other stakeholders. So let's make sure that we are being open and honest, and let's make sure that we provide the people the dignity and respect that they deserve if they have witnessed or have been victim of racial slurs. And lastly, accreditation. Accreditation and speaking up and speaking out are the only ways that we can really get this sorted. So that needs to be done in a more formalistic way. Speak the language of the administrators.
All right. Thank you so much, Christopher. And Kev, I'm going to go ahead and give this back over to you, but thank you all. Like, this has been such a great conversation with fantastic ideas. And it looks like we'll be talking about this some more. So Kevin, if you want to go ahead and close it out.
You know,
We're
y'all know we not done. For as long as this ecosystem been in place, we got work to do. We all know that. If we're not acknowledging that by now, it's like, come on. Again, we want to say thank you all so much for joining us. If you got the recording, we sorry you missed the live version, but we hope to see you next time. Throw that in there. Hannah, we appreciate you. I'm gonna turn over to Hannah. Anything you want to say from Diverse Educators before we close out?
No, just brilliant panel. Thank you for your contributions and your honesty and your sharings, and really great questions from the room. So thank you, everybody.
Awesome, thank you. And we followed the chat. We saw the chat. We saw what y'all need and what y'all want. So don't worry. And again, it's open that dialogue up to what's actually happening. Y'all heard Maher. Y'all heard it right from the student's mouth. One of ours from the ecosystem. And again, like we said, we plan on having more and more of these. If there's topics that you feel need to be discussed as well, again, let us know. Because we're not scared to address them and talk to them. But again, we thank you all so much. We know everyone has a wide range from counselors to leaders to teachers to alum who are on here to DEIJ leaders. We appreciate you so much, as well as the panel. We appreciate you, Juan. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Maher, and Dr. J. I'm gonna call you Dr. J. Thank you so much. we look forward to the next one. And again, come on, tell your colleagues. There's more. We have an entire April, as well as our May calendar. We're coming out. We're taking a rest in June, which we prioritize, and we highly suggest those that are in this work, make sure you take your time to rest over your holiday break that's up and coming. So we appreciate you all. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We'll see y'all soon.